The morning Eliza Garrison walked into Caldwell's general store with 11 cents in her pocket and a debt of $3.42 hanging over her head like a storm cloud that refused to move on. She had no way of knowing that a stranger standing quietly in the back of that store would change the entire course of her life. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Harlow Creek, Kansas, sat on the edge of the open plains like a rough stone waiting to be polished. The cattle drives had brought money to some people and dust to everyone else. The streets were wide and unpaved, the kind of wide that made you feel small when the wind came through from the north, carrying grit that stung your cheeks and made your eyes water. There were saloons and a livery stable and a church that needed a new roof, and there was Caldwell's general store, which had been standing on the corner of Main and Sycamore since before Eliza could properly remember. Eliza was 24 years old, and she had the kind of face that people described as honest rather than pretty, though on a good day, with her dark hair pinned neatly and her gray eyes catching the light, she was considerably more than merely honest-looking. She had come to Harlow Creek 3 years prior with her husband, Thomas Garrison, who had believed with the wholehearted conviction of a man who had never actually farmed a day in his life that the Kansas plains were going to make him rich. Thomas had been good at believing things. He had been less good at following through on them. He had died 14 months ago of a fever that swept through the lower quarters of town like an uninvited guest that nobody could ask to leave. And he had left Eliza with a small parcel of land, a mule named Chester, a leaking roof, and a collection of debts that seemed to multiply like rabbits in the spring. She had paid off most of those debts through sheer stubbornness. She took in mending. She sold eggs when the hens cooperated. She had traded 2 of Thomas's old rifles for feed and lumber, and she had patched the roof herself, climbing up there on a cool October morning with nails between her teeth and the kind of determined look on her face that made the neighbor boy, who had come to watch, decide immediately that he was not going to offer her help because she clearly didn't want it. But the debt at Caldwell's had persisted, $3.42. It had been more once. She had whittled it down slowly, a quarter here, 50 cents there, but it had a stubborn quality to it. That debt, and old Horace Caldwell, who ran the store with his wife Margaret, was not an unkind man, but he was a man with a ledger book and a pencil, and he kept track. She pushed through the door that Tuesday morning with her chin up and her shoulders square, the way her mother had taught her to face difficult things. The store smelled of coffee and tobacco and the faint sweetness of molasses, and the light came through the front windows in long yellow bars that caught the dust motes turning lazily in the air. Margaret Caldwell was behind the counter, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. There were 2 other customers in the store, a rancher's wife named Clara Bede, who was examining bolts of calico near the window, and a man standing in the back near the shelves of dry goods, his back to the room, studying something in his hand. Eliza didn't pay the man much attention. She walked to the counter and set her list down in front of Margaret, and they went through the process together, the kind of quiet, careful transaction that poor dignity requires. A pound of cornmeal, half a pound of salt pork, a small paper of coffee because she had told herself she would not give up coffee entirely. That was a line she was not willing to cross. A spool of white thread. The numbers were added up and Eliza counted out her coins and it came to $2.73 and she had only the 11. "I can give you 11 cents today," Eliza said, and her voice was steady and clear, though a heat had climbed into her face that she couldn't entirely suppress. "And I'll bring the rest as soon as I can manage it. Perhaps by the end of the month." Margaret Caldwell looked at her over the spectacles, not unkindly, but with the expression of a woman who had heard this particular sentence many times before from many different mouths. She opened the ledger book, and Eliza watched the pencil scratch the entry, and she heard the door at the back of the store creak softly, and then there were footsteps behind her, measured and unhurried. She didn't look around. She was busy counting out her 11 cents with the precision of someone who wished very much they were somewhere else entirely. "Put it on my bill," said a voice. It was a man's voice, quiet and even, not the kind that raised itself to be heard, but the kind that didn't need to. Eliza turned then because she had to, because those words had been spoken about her debt, and she needed to understand what was happening. The man standing a step behind her was not someone she recognized. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two either side of it, with a lean, sun-weathered face and dark brown eyes that were direct without being intrusive. He wore a plainsman's clothes, clean but lived-in dark trousers, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms, a leather vest that had seen considerable weather. He held his hat in his hand, which was a courtesy that registered somewhere in Eliza's awareness, and he was looking at Margaret Caldwell, not at Eliza, which she noticed too. "I beg your pardon," Margaret said. "The lady's account," he said. "Whatever she owes, I'll settle it now, add it to what I'm already getting." Eliza felt the heat in her face intensify considerably. "That is absolutely not necessary," she said. He looked at her then. He had the kind of eyes that were difficult to read quickly, not cold but composed, the way deep water looks composed because you can't see the bottom. "I know it isn't necessary," he said. "I'd like to do it anyway if you don't mind." "I do mind," she said. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed simply. "That's all right." He turned back to Margaret and settled the matter with the calm efficiency of a man who had made his decision and wasn't going to revisit it. He laid coins on the counter. Margaret, who was a practical woman and not about to turn away good money, entered it in the ledger without further ceremony. Eliza stood very still, watching this happen, feeling a complicated mixture of gratitude and indignation, and something else she didn't have a word for yet, something warm and unsettled. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her to say thank you even when she was furious. "May I at least know your name, so that I may repay you?" He picked up his hat and set it on his head, and there was something about the gesture, the ease of it, that stayed with her afterward, the way certain small things do. He looked at her with those composed dark eyes, and for just a moment she thought she saw something in them that wasn't quite composure, something that flickered and was gone. "Don't worry about it," he said. And then he collected his own purchases, which Margaret had wrapped in paper and tied with string, and he walked out through the door, and Eliza heard the soft jingle of a horse's harness through the window, and then he was gone. She stood in the middle of Caldwell's general store with her supplies wrapped up in front of her and $3.42 worth of debt erased from the world, and she didn't know his name. Clara Bede had been watching all of this from the window with the unabashed attention of a woman who collected other people's interesting moments the way some people collected stamps. "Well," she said, into the ringing silence. "That was something." Eliza walked home in the bright spring morning with Chester the mule walking slowly alongside her, and she thought about the man with the composed dark eyes and the hat and the quiet voice. She thought about him all the way home. She set her supplies on the kitchen table, and she thought about him while she put them away. She stood at the window that looked out over her small plot of land, at the grass coming up green after a long winter, at the sky that was a particular clean blue that only happened in Kansas in the spring, and she thought, "I am going to find out who he is." It was not a sentimental thought. It was a practical one, wrapped in the firm conviction that she did not accept charity from strangers and never would, and she intended to pay that man back every cent, and she could not do that without knowing his name. This was what she told herself. She believed it mostly. She started her inquiry the next morning because she was not a woman who wasted time. She went back to Caldwell's and she asked Margaret if she knew the man, described him in as much detail as she could manage, the lean face, the dark eyes, the leather vest, the way he carried himself. Margaret thought about it, pursing her lips in the way she did when she was being thorough. "He's been in a few times," she said. "He pays in cash, hasn't given a name. I assumed he was passing through." "He has a horse?" Eliza asked. "A bay," Margaret said. "A good one, not a working horse, I mean a proper horse. Well kept." Eliza nodded. She thanked Margaret and went to see Tom Aberly at the livery, who knew every horse that came through Harlow Creek with the intimacy of a man who cared considerably more about horses than about people. Tom scratched his chin. "Bay gelding, you say? Well built. Probably 16 hands, dark mane." He paused. "Saw one about a week ago. Man kept the horse here overnight. Paid for oats and fresh straw. Real particular about the animal's feet. Checked all four himself before he left." "Did he say his name?" Tom shook his head. "Didn't ask. He was quiet, polite, paid extra for the trouble without being asked." Eliza noted this. A man who paid extra without being asked. A man who paid other people's debts without giving his name. She tried the hotel, which in Harlow Creek was called the Prairie Rest, and had 8 rooms and a dining area that served beans and beef at most meals with very little variation. The woman at the desk, a thin, nervous person named Greta, had no record of him because he apparently had not stayed there. She tried the 2 saloons, the Dusty Boot and the Red Flag, but neither bartender could place him with any certainty from her description alone. Since, as the Red Flag's man pointed out with a certain resignation, a good many men of that general description came through a cattle town. After a week she had a bay horse, a leather vest, dark eyes, and a tendency toward quiet generosity. She did not have a name. She would have let it go, perhaps. She told herself she would let it go. But then, about 3 weeks after the incident at the store, she was at the church social, which happened the 3rd Saturday of every month and was one of the primary social events in Harlow Creek, and Clara Bede appeared at her elbow with a cup of lemonade and a look of barely contained excitement. "I saw him," Clara said. Eliza knew immediately who her meant. "Where?" "Riding out past the Morrison place, heading north. He tipped his hat to me, very proper. I nearly fell off my wagon." Clara pressed the lemonade into Eliza's hand. "He's not passing through, Eliza. He was headed toward the Ridgeland. People up that way, that's the Hendricks spread and the old Keller property." The old Keller property. Eliza knew it. Old Elias Keller had died 2 years back and left the land to no one in particular, and it had stood empty, people said, though she had heard occasional mention of someone having bought it quietly without much fanfare. Land transfers weren't always announced in the Harlow Creek Herald, which published news with a selectivity that was either editorial discretion or simple inconsistency, depending on your disposition. She did not go immediately to the Keller property, because she had her dignity and her sense of what was reasonable, and simply riding up to someone's land and announcing herself because she wanted to pay back $3.42 was not something she could do without more certainty. She continued her ordinary life, which required considerable effort. She tended her land and her mule and her hens. She took in mending and she sold eggs. She repaired the fence on the north side of her property, where Chester had been making increasingly confident attempts to investigate the beyond. She attended the church social, and she baked bread, and she sat on her porch in the evenings watching the sky go purple over the plains. But she also asked questions. Quietly, naturally, as part of ordinary conversation. She mentioned to Reverend Gibbs that she had heard someone had taken the old Keller place. Reverend Gibbs confirmed that a man had indeed purchased it sometime in the early months of the year, but the Reverend had not yet had the pleasure of meeting him, the new owner having not yet attended services, which was a state of affairs the Reverend mentioned with the patient sorrow of a man who considered it a professional loss. She mentioned to Doc Harmon, who kept his finger more thoroughly on the pulse of the town than anyone, that she was curious about the ridgeland north of town, and Doc Harmon, who had the memory of an encyclopedia and the storytelling instincts of a man who genuinely loved information, told her that a man had come to see him the previous month about a horse that had cut its leg on wire, and the man had been from the Ridgeland, and his name, Doc Harmon said, tilting back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man arriving at the point, his name had been Winslow, Martin Winslow. Eliza sat with that name for a moment, the way you sit with something you've been reaching for and have finally gotten hold of. Martin Winslow. She said it to herself on the walk home, not out loud, just in her mind, the way you test the weight and shape of something new. It was a solid name, an unpretentious name. It suited the composed dark eyes and the quiet voice and the hat held in the hand as a courtesy to the woman at the counter. She knew his name now. But she did not yet know enough about him to simply ride up to his property with money in her hand, and somewhere in the back of her mind, where she was scrupulously honest with herself even when she preferred not to be, she suspected that she was no longer inquiring purely for the purpose of repayment. She wanted to know who he was. It was a feeling she didn't entirely trust. She had been widowed for 14 months, and she had not spent that time in grief exactly. Thomas had been difficult to grieve, as he had been a kind man but not a particularly present one, even when he was alive. But she had spent it in a kind of careful reconstruction, building herself back up into a person who stood on her own feet and needed nothing from anyone. The thought of finding a man interesting was something she regarded with the wariness of someone who had put a great deal of effort into not being vulnerable to such things. But there it was, Martin Winslow, who paid debts without giving his name and checked all 4 of his horse's feet before leaving the livery. June came to Harlow Creek with heat and the smell of cut grass and the sound of cattle moving somewhere distant, always distant on the plains, a sound you felt rather than heard. Eliza had been asking questions for 2 months now, and she had assembled a fragmentary picture of Martin Winslow that was interesting precisely because of what wasn't in it. He had bought the old Keller property in January, paying cash. He had been seen in town perhaps a dozen times, always alone, always quiet, always paying more than he needed to and saying less than he could. Nobody knew where he had come from. Nobody knew what brought him to Harlow Creek specifically. The land he had bought was good land, not spectacular, with a creek running through the north field and an old house that needed work and several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. He seemed to be fixing it up. Tom Aberley at the livery had seen him loading lumber. The hardware store had sold him window glass and good nails and a quantity of whitewash. One warm Thursday in the middle of June, Eliza was taking mended laundry back to the bead place, because Clara was one of her steady customers in that regard, and the road to the bead place took her past the North Fork, and the North Fork road went up toward the ridge land, and she saw smoke rising from the direction of the Keller property, or what she was now privately calling the Winslow property, and she made a decision. She told Chester, who had strong opinions about departing from established routes, that they were going up the North Fork, and Chester expressed his opinion with his ears and his feet, and Eliza expressed hers with the reins, and Chester conceded the point. The property was bigger than she had expected. It spread out along a low rise with the creek visible as a dark line through the grass to the north. The house was a 2-story affair that had clearly been handsome once and was clearly in the process of becoming handsome again. She could see fresh wood where repairs had been made, and the porch had new planks, and the window on the upper left was newly glazed, the glass catching the afternoon sun with a brilliant flash that made her blink. There was a man on the roof of the nearest outbuilding, nailing down shingles with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this particular task for some hours and intended to finish it before dark. He heard Chester's hooves on the track and looked down. It was him. Of course it was him. The composed dark eyes, the lean weather-touched face. He was in his shirt sleeves, and there was a smear of something that might have been paint or whitewash on his left forearm. And he looked, she thought, surprised, though it was a very quiet kind of surprise. He climbed down from the roof with easy movements, unhurried, and she climbed down from the wagon with the kind of deliberate composure that she had been practicing mentally for approximately 2 months. "Mrs. Garrison," he said, which stopped her entirely. "You know who I am. Harlow Creek is a small town," he said. "I asked Margaret Caldwell after you left. I wanted to make sure you got home all right with your supplies." There were multiple things she could have said to that. What she said was, "I've been looking for you." "I know," he said. There was no smugness in it. There was something almost careful, the way you are careful with something you don't want to damage. You know. Tom Aberly mentioned you'd been asking about a bay horse. He looked at her steadily. I wasn't hiding. I just didn't want to make things awkward for you. Awkward, she said. I paid an account without being asked. Some people find that embarrassing. I didn't want you to feel you owed me any sort of explanation. Eliza Garrison looked at this man, Martin Winslow, who had paid her debt without giving his name, and then had stayed quiet to spare her embarrassment. And she felt something shift inside her chest, like something that had been braced against a door finally standing down. I brought this, she said, and held out the money she had been carrying for 2 months, $3.42 in coins, which she had wrapped in a clean square of cloth because she had carried them so long that she wanted them to arrive in a dignified condition. He looked at the offered cloth and didn't take it. You don't need to do that. Yes, she said firmly. I do. He looked at her for a moment with those unreadable eyes, and then something changed in them, something that might have been a smile if it had gotten any further along, and he took the cloth from her hand. His fingers were warm. The contact lasted no more than a second, and she was aware of it for considerably longer. Thank you, he said. And now, she said, will you tell me your name properly? Martin Winslow, he said. He held out his hand, which was what a man did when he was introducing himself to another man, not a woman, but she had the sense that he didn't make distinctions of that sort, that he extended the same courtesies to everyone because he had thought about what courtesy actually meant. She shook his hand. Eliza Garrison, she said, properly. He did smile then. It was a brief thing, a small generous thing, and it changed his face in a way that did something entirely inconvenient to Eliza's careful self-possession. He offered her coffee, which she accepted, and they sat on the porch of the house that was still being repaired, and he brought 2 tin cups and a coffee pot that he had been keeping warm on a small stove inside, and the afternoon light lay golden across the plains below the ridge, and Chester stood in the yard at the end of his tether looking philosophically at the grass. She asked about the land, because it was a natural thing to ask, and because she genuinely wanted to know. He told her he had come from Missouri, from a family with land there that had been taken apart by the war and the years after it, the kind of taking apart that happened quietly in the years following big violent things, through debt and difficulty, and the particular exhaustion of people who had survived something they hadn't expected to survive. He had worked cattle drives for 3 years after that. He was 31, he told her, without being asked, which made her think he had anticipated the question. He had bought this land because he wanted something of his own, something he had built himself, and because the land up here on the ridge was good and the price had been fair, and Harlow Creek had struck him, on first sight, as a town with decent people in it. Is it? She asked. Decent people. On the evidence so far, he said, and looked at her with that quiet directness that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he looked at everything. She told him about her land and about Thomas, not in great detail, not the kind of detail you give someone you've just met, but enough. She told him about the mending and the eggs and the patched roof. He listened the way he seemed to do everything, with complete attention, and without the impulse to fill silences that most people had. She stayed longer than she had planned to. When she finally stood and thanked him and went to Chester, who had eaten an impressive amount of his grass ration and was ready to move on, she realized that the afternoon had turned toward evening and the sky was putting on one of its Kansas performances, orange and rose and a deep, deep blue at the top. May I call on you sometime? He asked. He was standing at the edge of the porch, his arms folded across his chest, and he asked it the way he said everything without performance, the words carrying exactly their own weight and no more. She looked at him. She considered the question with the honesty she brought to all important things. Yes, she said, I'd like that. He came to call the following Sunday, which was sooner than she had expected, and she found that she was pleased by the promptness. He came in the late morning and stayed through the afternoon, and they walked her fence line because she mentioned it needed looking at, and he helped her assess the damage Chester had done to the north section with the practiced eye of a man who had built and repaired things with his hands and knew what he was looking at. He didn't fix it for her, which she appreciated. He looked at it with her and told her what he thought the problem was and what materials would address it most efficiently. And she asked questions and he answered them. And they talked about fencing and about soil quality and about the difficulty of keeping chickens from wandering too far afield. And none of it was romantic in any conventional sense, but all of it felt more honest and more pleasurable than any conversation she had had in a very long time. He came back the next Sunday. And the one after that. By July, the visits had settled into a pattern, alternating between her land and his, because she had made it clear early on that she had her own interest in seeing how the repairs on his property were coming along, and that she would not be restricted to the role of the person being visited. He had accepted this without comment, which she found increasingly characteristic of him. He had a way of simply accommodating the reality of who she was without requiring her to explain or justify it. The 4th of July brought the town of Harlow Creek out into the street for a celebration that was part patriotic and part simply a reason to stop working and eat good food, and let the children run until they tired themselves out. Eliza went with Clara Bede and Clara's husband James, and she wore her good dress, the blue one with the small white buttons that she had mended so many times it was essentially a different dress from the one she had bought, though the fabric at the skirt still had something of its original quality. She saw Martin across the street, talking to Reverend Gibbs, who had clearly gotten hold of him at last, and was expressing his satisfaction at the new parishioner with the gentle but unrelenting enthusiasm of a man whose professional life was measured in souls. Martin was listening with what she was learning to recognize as his patient attentiveness, and when he saw her across the street, he did something that stopped her mid-step. He smiled at her. Not the brief, small, private smile she had seen on the porch that first afternoon. A real smile, open and warm and entirely unguarded, the kind that travels across a street and arrives like something solid and warm. Clara, who had the romantic instincts of a hound dog and the observational skills to match, made a sound beside her that was somewhere between approval and delight. "Hush," Eliza said. "I didn't say anything," Clara said, entirely unconvincingly. He made his way over to them, and she introduced him to Clara and James, and they ate together at the long tables that had been set up along Main Street, and he sat beside her in the natural way of something that had already been established. And James Bede, who was a straightforward man with no patience for pretension of any kind, liked him immediately and said so in the plain-spoken Bede way, which meant he spent most of the meal asking Martin questions about cattle and land management that were more test than conversation and receiving answers that apparently satisfied him, because by the end of the evening, James was talking to Martin with the easy manner he reserved for people he had decided were worth his time. After the fireworks, which were more smoke than spectacle but which everyone agreed were excellent, he walked her home. Chester was in the barn, which was where Chester lived, and the house was quiet and smelled of the soap she used to clean the floors. They stood on the porch in the warm dark, and she could hear the distant music from the celebration still going on at the far end of town, and she could hear the crickets in the grass, and she was profoundly aware of him standing a few feet away, hat in hand again, that courtesy that she had noticed from the very beginning. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." She had been expecting something along these lines. She had been, if she was honest, hoping for something along these lines, but hearing it said, plainly and directly in his quiet voice, without embellishment or performance, she felt it go through her like the first warmth of a fire after a very cold day. "I'm willing," she said. He came twice a week after that. Tuesdays, which were relatively quiet days on both their properties, and Sundays after church, which he was now attending with the regularity that Reverend Gibbs found deeply gratifying, and that the rest of the congregation noticed with the interest of people who understood what it meant when a bachelor in a new town made himself visible. They rode out together on Tuesdays, sometimes to the creek on his land, sometimes just across the open prairie, and she came to know his horse, whose name was Rook, the bay gelding from Tom Aberly's description, who was indeed a very good horse, and she brought Chester because Chester had an unexpected dignity on horseback excursions that didn't show up in any other context. Martin never commented on Chester's relative magnificence compared to Rook, because he was a man who treated all creatures with respect regardless of their formal distinction, and Eliza loved him for this, though she hadn't gotten to the love part yet, not quite. She was moving toward it carefully, the way you move toward something that matters very much and that you don't want to rush. August came in hot and dry and demanding. The prairie grass cured yellow, and the creek on the Winslow land went down to half its spring level. 3 ranches north of town lost cattle to a disease that moved through the summer heat with grim efficiency, and the conversations at the general store and the church pew and the dinner tables of Harlow Creek were full of the anxiety that the land always eventually produced, the awareness of how much depended on things that were entirely outside human control. Martin's land was not affected by the disease, and he was quietly, practically helpful to his neighbors in a way that the town took note of without making a fuss about, because fussing wasn't the Harlow Creek style. He helped the Morrison family mend their south fence when their hired man broke his leg. He went out with the Hendricks boys when they were searching for cattle that had drifted and found half of them in a gully 3 miles east. He did these things without announcement or expectation, the same way he had paid Eliza's debt in Caldwell's store, and the town settled him into its estimation with the quiet permanence that small communities reserved for people who had proven themselves through action. Eliza watched him become part of the community and felt a pride in it that surprised her, because it was not the pride of ownership. It was something more like the pride of recognition, the feeling of having seen something truly before anyone else saw it clearly. One Tuesday in late August, they rode out to a flat open place on the northwest edge of his property from which you could see the full expanse of the plains to the south and west, miles and miles of it, the grass gone gold and the sky a tremendous blue, and they sat their horses for a moment in the late afternoon silence, and she was thinking about a great many things. About Thomas and about the widow years and about the debt at Caldwell's general store and about the way certain things in life seem accidental until you look back at them and see the shape. "My wife died," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the plains. His hands were easy on Rook's reins and his voice had been steady, but she could hear what the steadiness was covering. "I didn't know," she said. 4 years ago, in Missouri, he was quiet for a moment. Fever. It was very quick. He looked at her then and the composure was still there, but it was a different quality of composure now, the kind that comes from having come through something and still carrying it. I don't mention it because I don't want people to handle me differently. But I thought you should know." "What was her name?" Eliza asked. "Anne," he said. "She was kind. She was very kind." Eliza thought about Thomas, not resentfully, but honestly, the way she had learned to think about him. "Thomas was not the easiest man to love," she said. "He meant well, but he was never quite here, even when he was here. I don't say that to speak ill of him. I say it because it's true and because I think you deserve honesty." Martin looked at her. "And now," he said quietly, "are you here?" It was a question that meant more than it said. She understood it completely. "Yes," she said, "I'm here." They rode back in the long late light, and he helped her down from Chester at the edge of her property. And when he helped her down, he held her hands a moment after she had her feet on the ground, and she let him. And they stood there in the fading day with their hands together, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. He kissed her for the first time in September, on her porch in the early evening, after they had eaten supper together, which had become a regular thing without anyone formally announcing it. She had made a beef stew because the weather had finally shifted toward something cooler, and he had brought apples from a tree on his property that was, he said, about the only original Keller improvement that had been worth keeping. They ate at her table in the kitchen and talked about the coming winter and about whether the Harlow Creek Herald was ever going to get around to hiring an editor who could spell. And when they moved to the porch for the cool of it, he stopped before she sat down and turned to her with a question in his eyes. She answered it before he asked it. She put her hand against his jaw, which was rough with the end of a working day, and he kissed her, and it was exactly as honest and unhurried as everything else about him. And she felt the last of the careful distance she had been keeping collapse entirely, not violently, not with any particular drama, just the way a wall comes down when you've decided you don't need it anymore. When they separated, she was looking up at him and the stars were out, which always happened faster in Kansas than you expected. "I should tell you," she said, "that I have known your name since June." He tilted his head slightly. There was a warmth in his eyes that made her want to smile. "Since June." "Doc Harmon," she said, "he told me. And you waited until October to come up the North Fork Road." "I was being careful," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know, I was too," she laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her by its own depth, and he smiled at the sound of it the way someone smiles at something they have been wanting and have just been given. October settled over Harlow Creek the way it did in Kansas, the warmth hanging on longer than you expected, and then releasing all at once into the clear cold blue of proper autumn. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek went yellow, and the mornings had a frost that made the grass silver until the sun got up. Eliza found herself humming while she worked, which was something she hadn't done in a very long time, and she was brisk and businesslike about recognizing why. She was in love with Martin Winslow. She had arrived at this conclusion in the way she arrived at most conclusions, through careful examination of the evidence, and the evidence was now overwhelming. She was in love with the way he listened, and the way he checked his horse's feet, and the way he called her by her first name when they were alone, which he had started doing in August, and the way he had told her about Anne, trusting her with something important and private. She was in love with the kiss on the porch and the apples from the Keller tree and the smile that traveled across the street on the 4th of July. She was honest enough to admit, somewhat afraid of it, in the way that you are afraid of things that matter enormously. She had built a good life out of the rubble of the widow years, and she was protective of it. She trusted Martin. She trusted him quite completely, but trust and fear are not mutually exclusive, and she understood that what she was feeling was not a reason to pull back but a measure of how much she was in. Martin came on a Tuesday in the middle of October, and he was quiet in a way that she read immediately as the quiet before something important. They were at her place, sitting in the kitchen because the evenings were cold now, and she had made coffee, and he was turning his cup in his hands in a slow circular motion that she had come to understand was what he did when he was organizing his thoughts. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked up from the coffee cup. The lamp on the table between them made the light warm and close. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I know I want to be straightforward about it. I'm not going to put it as a question that you're expected to answer a certain way because I've arranged everything. I'm asking because I want to, because I have wanted to since sometime in August if I'm honest, and I've been waiting because I wanted to be sure you were ready to hear it." She looked at him across the table. She thought of the morning in Caldwell's general store, the morning she had walked in with 11 cents and walked out with her debt cleared and the first thread of something she hadn't expected. She thought of 2 months of careful questions and the North Fork Road and the afternoon on the porch with 2 tin cups of coffee. She thought of the July smile across the street and the hands held at the edge of her property and the September evening when a wall had come down. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hands were warm. They were always warm, she had noticed, even in cold weather, which she found unreasonably comforting. "Good," he said. And then he smiled, that full, generous smile, and she felt it the same way she had the first time, like something solid and warm arriving from across a distance. They told no one until the following Sunday, when they told Reverend Gibbs together before the service, which Reverend Gibbs received with the profound personal satisfaction of a man who felt he had contributed to the outcome by having had Martin standing in exactly the right place to see Eliza at the 4th of July celebration. He announced the engagement to the congregation at the close of the service with a beaming enthusiasm that was somewhat more theatrical than Eliza had anticipated, but Martin squeezed her hand in the pew, and she decided it was all right. Clara Bede burst into delighted tears, which she was not remotely embarrassed about. James Bede pumped Martin's hand and said, with the Bede directness, that he was glad because Eliza deserved someone decent, and Martin was apparently decent enough. Martin took this as the compliment it was meant to be. They were married in November, on a day when the sky was cold and clear and brilliant, one of those Kansas days when the air is so clean that you feel you can see 100 miles in every direction. Eliza wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself, with the good fabric she had been saving for something important, and she put her dark hair up with the tortoiseshell pins that had been her mother's, and Clara Bede said she looked beautiful, and Martin's face when she came down the aisle of the church said exactly the same thing without any words at all. Reverend Gibbs performed the ceremony with a dignity tempered by barely contained joy, and the whole town seemed to be in attendance, which was the character of Harlow Creek, that it showed up for things that mattered. The reception was in the church hall, with a long table of food that the women of the congregation had contributed collectively, and there was music from the Morrison boy, who played fiddle with a talent that always surprised people, because he was otherwise fairly quiet and unmemorable. When they danced, she and Martin, it was the first time she had danced in years, and he was not a showy dancer, but he was a steady one, and he held her correctly and he paid attention, and she put her forehead briefly against his shoulder because she wanted to and because it was now, as of approximately 2 hours ago, entirely her right to do so. "Martin," she said quietly into his shoulder. "Yes," he said, his voice soft above her ear. "I'm glad I couldn't pay my bill at Caldwell's that morning." She felt him laugh, the movement of it through his chest against her forehead, a warm, private thing. "So am I," he said. They went home to the Winslow property, which was what everyone had already taken to calling it, and which was Eliza's home now, and it was a proper home, the repairs all but complete, the windows glazed, the porch solid, a fire laid in the main room. Martin had put fresh flowers on the kitchen table, which she discovered when they came in from the cold, a small clay vase with late autumn blooms that he must have found somewhere with considerable effort because it was November in Kansas, and flowers were not readily available. She looked at them for a moment, and then she looked at him. "You are a great deal more romantic than you allow people to see," she said. "Don't tell anyone," he said. "I have a reputation for being practical." She laughed and kissed him, and the fire in the main room snapped and settled, and outside the wind was moving over the Kansas plain the way it always did, indifferent and vast, and inside the house it was warm and it was theirs. The winter was hard, the way Kansas winters are hard, not dramatically catastrophic but deeply insistent, the cold settling in and staying, the snow coming in January and staying past February. They were largely cut off from town for stretches of days at a time, which Eliza found, to her mild surprise, not difficult at all. She had expected that being restricted to a single house with a single person might produce the friction of enforced proximity, but it didn't. They read by the fire in the evenings, Martin with the almanac and the land survey maps that he studied with the focus of a man planning something long-term, Eliza with whatever books she could get from the small lending library that Margaret Caldwell maintained in the back of the store. They talked about everything. They talked about Missouri and about Thomas and about Anne and about the cattle drives and about what Eliza had been like as a girl, which she described with a dry humor that made Martin laugh, and about what Martin had been like as a boy, which he described with the same matter-of-fact honesty he brought to everything else. She learned that he had a younger brother named Robert, who was in Colorado, working a mining claim that Martin considered inadvisable, but that he had not said much about because Robert was 26 and entitled to his own inadvisable decisions. She learned that he had fought in the tail end of the war between the states, on the Union side, at 17, which explained certain things about the quality of his steadiness. She learned that he liked rain, genuinely liked it, went out and stood in it sometimes, which she found endearing in a way she couldn't fully explain. She told him things, too. About the first year in Harlow Creek with Thomas, when she had still believed in his enthusiasms, and the land had still seemed full of possibility. About the fever winter and the long, strange months of widowhood. About the morning she had stood in Caldwell's general store with 11 cents in her pocket, and the particular quality of humiliation that poverty carries when you are a person who had been raised to stand on your own feet. "I thought about just leaving," she told him one evening when the fire was low and the wind was high outside, "packing Chester and whatever I could carry and going back east to my aunt's house in Ohio." "What made you stay?" he asked. She thought about it seriously. "I think," she said, "I didn't want to be the kind of person who left. There's a version of you that you're trying to become, and when you're in difficulty you find out how committed you are to it." He looked at her with that expression he sometimes had, the one that had something in it like wonder, quiet wonder, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. "I think," he said, "that was the right decision." She looked at him across the firelight. "I think so too," she said. By February she knew she was expecting a child. She told Martin on a morning when the snow was thick outside, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and she had been holding the knowledge to herself for a few days, not from secrecy but from the desire to carry it alone for a short while, to know it quietly before it became something they shared. He had been sitting at the table with his coffee and his maps, and she sat down across from him and said, "I expect we're going to need another room before the end of the summer." He looked up. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was absorbing something important. And then his face did something she had never quite seen it do before, something that she would remember for the rest of her life. The careful composure completely dissolved, replaced by a joy that was so unguarded and so whole that she felt her eyes sting with the fullness of it. He reached across the maps and took both her hands and held them, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, and when he did, his voice had that quality it got when something mattered enormously. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" It was exactly the right question. It was so entirely the right first question that she loved him about 10% more in that moment than she had a moment before, which was already quite a lot. "I'm perfectly well," she said, "and very happy." He stood up and came around the table and held her, standing in the kitchen of the house on the ridge with the snow outside and the coffee going cold on the table, and she put her arms around him and felt his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong and present, entirely present, and she thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like all along. Spring came back to Harlow Creek with its customary sweeping gesture, the green moving up from the south, and the creek rising on the north field, and the new lambs on the Hendricks property bleating in the early morning. Martin built the extra room with the focused determination of a man who had given himself a deadline. He worked on it in the evenings and on Sundays, and James Bede came out to help because he was that kind of neighbor, and the Morrison boy who fixed the fence and the fiddle came out one Saturday and proved surprisingly useful with a hammer. Eliza fed them all at the end of the day, which was the proper economy of such arrangements. She continued her egg business and her mending through the spring and into early summer, because she was herself and not going to stop being herself on account of being married and expecting. And Martin understood this the way he understood most things about her, not as a point requiring negotiation, but as a simple fact of who she was. He had never once suggested she should do less or manage less or expect less of herself, which was not universally true of the husbands in Harlow Creek, and was something she was quietly grateful for every single day. Clara Bede took it upon herself to be the primary source of advice and practical assistance regarding the coming baby, which Eliza accepted because Clara had 3 children and genuine expertise, and because Clara would have done it regardless, which you had to respect. Doc Harmon came out to the Winslow property in May, and in July, and each time he left with the satisfied expression of a man who had found nothing to worry about. The town was changing around them that spring and summer. The railroad had been pushing west, and there was word that a spur line was going to come within 20 miles of Harlow Creek, which meant different things to different people. The ranchers thought it was the best news in years. The people who had come to the territory for the wildness and the distance weren't entirely sure. A man named Patterson had bought land south of town and was bringing in considerably more cattle than the land could comfortably carry. And there were tensions about water rights that Martin got quietly involved in mediating, because he had read the territorial land law with the thoroughness of a man who believed in understanding the rules before deciding which ones needed changing. One afternoon in June, Eliza was at the store when she overheard 2 men talking near the door in voices that were not as low as they imagined. The kind of conversation that happens when people assume a woman isn't paying proper attention. They were talking about the Patterson situation, about the water, about how the smaller properties were going to have trouble, and one of them said something about the Winslow place and the creek that ran through the north field, and the other one said something about how Winslow had better watch himself if Patterson decided he wanted that water. She paid for her supplies and went home and told Martin what she had heard. He listened without interrupting, asked 2 precise questions, and then was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the north field where the creek caught the evening light. "Patterson's been to see me," he said. "When?" "Last week. I didn't mention it because I didn't want to worry you." She looked at him with an expression that clearly communicated her thoughts on the subject of not worrying her. He acknowledged it with a slight inclination of his head that was an apology. "What did he want?" she asked. "He wanted to make an arrangement about the creek water, an arrangement that would have been quite favorable to him and considerably less favorable to us." "What did you tell him?" "I told him no," Martin said simply, politely but clearly, and he suggested that I might find the territory less hospitable than I anticipated. Martin's voice was absolutely even. "I told him that I had lived through worse than an unpleasant cattle baron, and that the creek was on my deed and I'd be grateful if he'd restrict himself to his own land." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Are you concerned?" "I'm keeping my eyes open," he said, which was not quite the same as no but was honest, and she valued his honesty more than she would have valued empty reassurance. The Patterson situation resolved itself over the following weeks in the way that territorial disputes often did, through the application of land law by people who knew how to read it, and were not intimidated by men who assumed that loud certainty was the same as legal right. Martin, working with the county surveyor and a lawyer who came up from Wichita at his invitation, established the water rights documentation with the clean finality of a man who believed that facts properly established were the best defense available. Patterson was not happy about it, but Patterson was also not stupid enough to push against a documented legal position, and he moved his cattle operation further south that autumn, and the tension dissipated in the way of things whose foundations turn out to be bluster. The town watched how Martin had handled it with the quiet approval of a community that had seen enough bullying in its time to recognize and respect principled opposition. Doc Harmon told Eliza at one of his visits that Martin had done the whole town a service, because Patterson had been eyeballing other water sources too, and needed to understand that Harlow Creek was not a town that rolled over. The baby came in late August, in a summer that had been hot but not as cruel as the previous one, On a Tuesday morning when the sky outside the window was the particular pale blue of early light. It was a boy. He came into the world with the energetic protest of someone who had strong opinions about the transition and was not shy about expressing them. And Doc Harmon said he was healthy and fine. And Clara Bede, who had been there, said he had his father's dark eyes, and that was going to cause trouble someday. And Martin held his son in the kitchen of the house he had repaired with his own hands, and looked at him with an expression that Eliza, exhausted and happy and watching from the bed, recognized as the same unguarded joy she had seen the morning in February when she had told him about the extra room. They named him James Thomas Winslow. James for James Bede, because it was right, and Thomas because Eliza wanted to give Thomas something, a dignity he hadn't always managed for himself but that she could give him now, when she could afford to be generous. Martin sat beside her bed that evening, James Thomas asleep in the small cradle that Martin had built from cottonwood timber in April, and he held her hand and they were both quiet, and the night outside was the warm dark of a Kansas August, and the crickets were very loud. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she said. "For coming up the North Fork Road." She squeezed his hand. "You knew who I was before I came up the road." "I know," he said, "but I wasn't going to come to you." That wasn't mine to do. She thought about this. It was very like him. "You just waited." "I hoped," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at her husband in the lamplight, this man who had paid a debt without giving his name, who had spared her embarrassment by staying quiet, who had waited and hoped and asked if she was well before anything else. She looked at the cradle where their son was sleeping with the deep, uncomplicated abandonment of the very newly born. "I am so glad," she said, "that I could not pay my bill." He laughed softly, not to wake the baby, the warm, quiet laugh she loved more than she could easily say. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The years that followed settled into the good shape of a life well built. The Winslow property grew as Martin bought the adjacent parcel to the east in the spring of 1880, adding a second field that he turned to winter wheat, which proved a sound decision as the cattle market began its complicated fluctuations, and the men with diversified land fared better than those who had bet everything on a single enterprise. Eliza's egg business expanded into something more properly called a small farm enterprise, with an arrangement with Caldwell's General Store that she had negotiated herself, and which gave her a reliable income that she kept track of in her own ledger, with the same precision that old Horace Caldwell had once used to track her debt. She took an interest in the Harlow Creek School, which had been operating in a single room with a series of teachers who tended to leave as soon as they had any better option. She served on the school committee from 1880 onward, a position she treated as seriously as any other important obligation, and she was instrumental in hiring a teacher named Mr. Ellsworth, who was not going to leave because he had come to the territory for his health and had found, to his own surprise, that he liked teaching and liked Harlow Creek. James Thomas grew up with the particular energy of a first child who is entirely certain that the world was arranged for his benefit, a conviction that his parents treated with affectionate firmness. He had Martin's eyes and Eliza's voice, the clear carrying quality of someone who had things to say and intended to say them. And by the time he was 3, he was following his father around the property with the absolute certainty that whatever his father was doing was the most important thing happening anywhere. Martin's brother Robert came from Colorado in the autumn of 1880, having concluded, with the delayed pragmatism that younger brothers sometimes achieve after the inadvisable interlude, that mining in Colorado was not his fortune, and that perhaps his brother's kind of steady building was worth a closer look. He stayed for a month, during which he helped with the wheat harvest and ate enormously and made Eliza laugh more than she had expected, because Robert had a gift for comedy that Martin entirely lacked, and the two of them together in the kitchen in the evenings were a study in contrasts, Martin quiet and steady, Robert animated and broad, and she loved them both in entirely different ways. Robert liked Harlow Creek. He came back the following spring. By 1882, he had bought a small parcel 2 miles south and was running a modest cattle operation, and the question of whether he was staying permanently was resolved by the fact that he began courting a schoolteacher's daughter named Helen Marsh, with a focus that surprised everyone who knew how scattered he generally was. The population of Harlow Creek grew through the early 80s as the railroad spur came through and the commerce it brought settled in. New buildings went up on the south end of Main Street. A proper hotel replaced the Prairie Rest. The Harlow Creek Herald hired an editor who could spell, which Eliza and Martin celebrated quietly over supper the evening. The first properly edited issue appeared. There was a debate in the community about the changes, the old argument that always comes when growth arrives, about what was gained and what was lost. And Martin participated in these conversations with the balance of a man who understood that some change was necessary, and some change was careless, and the skill was in telling the difference. He was, by the time he had been in Harlow Creek for 5 years, a person of genuine standing in the community, not of the showy kind but the kind that builds itself slowly out of consistent, reliable action. When there was a dispute about land or water, people asked Martin. When the town council needed a practical voice, Martin was on it. He did not seek these positions. He was asked into them by people who trusted him, which was the only kind of standing that Eliza thought was worth having. She told him this one evening, when he had come home from a county meeting looking more tired than usual, the kind of tired that comes from being patient for a long time with people who are being difficult. She made tea, which she did when the occasion called for something quieter than coffee, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table that had heard most of the important conversations of their life together. "They want me to stand for county commissioner," he said, turning his cup in the circular motion she knew so well. "Do you want to?" she asked. "I want things to be organized properly, and for the water rights to be clear for everyone and for the school to have a second room," he said. "Whether I need to be county commissioner to achieve that is the question." "You'd be good at it," she said. He looked at her. "You think so?" "I think you're good at most things you try," she said, and this was not flattery, it was the considered assessment of a woman who paid attention. "I think you're honest and you don't lose your temper and you understand the law and you care about the people in this place. Those are the qualifications." He was quiet. "It would take time away from the land." "Yes," she said, "it would, and I would manage." "I know you would," he said, and the way he said it carried 3 years of watching her manage things and loving her for how she did it. He stood for county commissioner in the fall of 1882, and won with the comfortable margin of a man who had spent 4 years being useful without expectation. He served 2 terms, during which the water rights documentation for the entire county was substantially improved, and the Harlow Creek School got its second room. And when he chose not to stand for a 3rd term, the community accepted it with the grace of people who understood that a man had a right to decide what his life was for. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1883, a girl this time, with Eliza's dark hair and a temperament that was entirely her own, combining her father's quiet observation with her mother's unswerving determination in a way that was both wonderful and challenging. They named her Anna Clara. Anna for Martin's first wife, because Eliza had offered the name herself and meant it, because she was that kind of woman, and Clara for Clara Bede, who cried again with the same wholehearted lack of embarrassment, and said that she was entirely unashamed of it and challenged anyone to criticize her. James Thomas adored his sister with the fierce territorial protectiveness of a first child toward a sibling who has had the audacity to arrive and immediately become fascinating. He spent considerable time explaining things to Anna, who couldn't understand a word of it yet, with the earnest pedagogical enthusiasm of a 4-year-old who knew things and felt strongly that knowledge should be shared. Martin came in one evening from the fields and found Eliza at the kitchen table with Anna in her lap and James Thomas standing on a chair beside them, explaining at length and in considerable detail the mechanics of a plow, which he had apparently observed that afternoon and had strong feelings about. Martin stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching the evening light behind him, his hat in his hand, the way it had been in the beginning. He looked at his wife and his children in the kitchen of his house, and the expression on his face was the same one he'd had that morning in February when she'd said they were going to need another room, the same February morning when the composure had dissolved entirely into something whole and unguarded and true. He looked at Eliza. She looked at him. James Thomas was still explaining the plow. "You're home," she said. "I am," he said. It was such a simple thing to say, and it meant everything it could mean. Home as a place, and home as a state, and home as the person you came back to. And she smiled at him across the kitchen, and he smiled back. And Anna reached up and grabbed a handful of Eliza's hair with the decisive certainty of a person who knew what she wanted. And James Thomas moved on from the plow to the harrow, and the evening settled in around them warm and close. The autumn of 1885 brought a letter from Robert in Colorado, which had not been sent from Colorado but from a place called Trinidad, Colorado, and it was addressed to both of them, which was unusual, and it said that he had left the Colorado operation and had come to a decision, and he hoped they would be glad to hear it. He arrived 3 weeks later, lean from the road and brown from the sun, and visibly happy in the way of someone who had made the right choice. And he brought with him Helen Marsh, who was now Helen Winslow, having married him in a civil ceremony in Trinidad. And the two of them stood in the yard of the Winslow property in October with the cottonwood leaves blowing gold around them, and Martin shook his brother's hand and Eliza embraced Helen, who was calm and lovely, and looked at Robert with the patient knowledge of a woman who had decided. She understood a man's best possibilities better than he did. Robert had found a parcel to buy south of town, adjacent to his original plot, and he was going to run cattle properly, which he appeared to have learned to do from necessity in Colorado. And Helen was going to teach at the Harlow Creek School, which Mr. Ellsworth, who had been carrying both rooms alone since the second room opened, received as the answer to a long prayer. The two households settled into the easy proximity of family that had chosen its own geography, Sunday suppers that alternated between the two properties, children who grew up knowing their uncle and aunt as constants in the landscape of their days. In the spring of 1887, Eliza was standing in Caldwell's General Store, which had expanded somewhat since 1878, and was now run by Horace and Margaret's son Franklin and his wife, who had taken over when Horace and Margaret retired to a small house on the east end of town, where Margaret had a garden that she treated as a full-time occupation. Franklin kept the store with the same honest efficiency his father had, and the ledger book was still there, though Eliza's name had long since been cleared from it. She was buying cornmeal and salt and a new spool of thread, and Anna was with her, 4 years old and possessed of the conviction that a general store was a place of nearly limitless fascination. She was examining with deep and solemn concentration a display of ribbon that Franklin had put in the window. A woman came in through the door, young, perhaps 20, with a tired face and a carefully held dignity, the kind of dignity that costs something, and she set her list down on the counter. Franklin went through the numbers, and Eliza, on the other side of the store, could hear the quiet, careful transaction without meaning to. The young woman counted her coins and came up short. Not by much, but short, and Eliza watched her face in that moment, the controlled, precise way she managed it, the same way Eliza had managed it herself once, standing at this same counter with 11 cents and a $3 debt. Before she had thought it through entirely, Eliza was at the counter. "Put the difference on my account," she said to Franklin. The young woman turned. She had blue eyes and flower on her sleeve and the expression of someone receiving something unexpected in a moment when unexpected things are hard to absorb. "It's all right," Eliza said, and she smiled, and she meant every bit of it. "We all need a hand sometimes. Don't give it another thought." "I don't know how to thank you," the young woman said. "You don't need to," Eliza said. "Just pass it on when you can." Anna came away from the ribbon display with the unhurried gravity of a child who has made an important decision and took hold of her mother's hand, and they walked out of the store together into the bright spring morning. And Eliza thought of the man who had stood behind her at this same counter 9 years ago, quiet and deliberate, hat in hand, who had paid without giving his name and had changed everything by doing it. She told Martin about it that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and they were sitting on the porch in the late spring warmth. And as he always did, completely. "Good," he said when she finished. "I kept thinking about you," she said. "That morning, what it felt like." "What did it feel like?" he asked. He was looking at the plains the way he did in the evenings, that long regard for the distance that she had come to love. "Like being seen," she said. "When you were mostly invisible." She paused. "And angry. I was also quite angry." He turned to look at her, and the warm smile was there, the real one. "I know," he said. "I could tell. You could tell. You had a very particular way of counting out your coins," he said. She laughed. He always made her laugh in the way that was most true, the unexpected kind, the kind that came from being known. "You are impossible," she said. "You walked the length of Harlow Creek asking about a bay horse," he said. "I think we're well matched." She leaned against him on the porch bench, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the spring evening with the prairie stretching out below the ridge, the same prairie, the same stars, the same wind that had been there from the beginning. Somewhere to the south, in the dark, a coyote made its wavering sound against the sky and went quiet again. Martin pressed his lips to the top of her head, a small, simple, private thing, the kind of gesture that doesn't perform itself but simply exists. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about the question with the honesty she brought to all important things. She thought about the widow years and the 11 cents and the North Fork Road and the February morning and the children asleep inside, and her brother-in-law's land to the south, and the woman in the general store with flour on her sleeve, and the way Martin Winslow smiled across a street. "Yes," she said, "completely." The wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the stars were out, and the great dark plain of Kansas lay under them, quiet and immense, and Martin Winslow held his wife on their porch in the night, and she held him back, and the house behind them held their sleeping children and the warmth of a life that had been built deliberately and well, the way the best things are built, one honest moment at a time. Beginning with a stranger who paid a debt without giving his name, and a woman who spent 6 months finding out who he was, and found, when she did, exactly what she had been looking for. The letter from Robert arrived the following week with the news that Helen was expecting their first child, and the two households responded with the particular joy that family happiness produces, James Thomas being informed that there would be a cousin, and receiving this information with the serious nodding consideration of someone adding it to a comprehensive worldview, and Anna being told the same thing and responding by immediately going to find her best ribbon, which she had decided she would give the baby, regardless of whether the baby was in any condition to appreciate ribbon. Martin read the letter at the table and looked at Eliza over the top of it, and the look was full of the kind of shared happiness that passes between two people who have learned to be glad about the gladness of people they love. He folded the letter carefully along its original lines and set it down. "We should have Robert and Helen to supper on Sunday," he said. "I was already planning it," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had that February morning years ago, his fingers warm around hers, steady as everything about him was steady. "Of course you were," he said. She turned her hand in his and held on, looking at him across the kitchen table with the October morning light coming through the window. She had watched him reglaze the first autumn after they married, when he had gone up on a ladder with new putty and glass, and she had handed tools up to him, and they had argued in a friendly way about the proper method. And she had been right, which she had mentioned once, and then not again, because she was not that kind of person mostly. Outside, the Kansas sky was doing something beautiful, the clouds moving enormous and white over the blue, and the wheat in the east field was bronze and ready, and Rook was in the pasture, and Chester, old Chester, was in his corner of the barn where he had been for 11 years now, moving slower but still entirely convinced of his own significance. The house on the ridge stood solid and whole, with the repaired porch and the glazed windows, and the room that Martin had built before James Thomas arrived, and the addition on the north side that they had built together the year after Anna was born, working side by side on the same project the way they worked on most things, each bringing what they had, making something better together than either could have made alone. Eliza Garrison Winslow looked at her husband in the morning light, at the man with the composed dark eyes and the warm hands who had held his hat as a courtesy, and changed her life without meaning to, who had paid a debt without giving his name, and waited for her to come to him on her own terms, who had asked if she was well before anything else, who had put flowers on the kitchen table on their wedding night and told her about Anne and smiled across the street at the 4th of July and kissed her on the porch in the September dark. She looked at the man who was her life's true companion, honest and steady and present, entirely present, and she thought, all of it, every bit of it. Every hard morning and every cold winter and every careful step on every road that brought her here. All of it had been entirely worth it. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and outside the wind was moving over the plains and the clouds were going somewhere and the wheat was ready and the day was waiting, and they had everything that mattered and they both knew it, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.